Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal. It's time for part 4 of the Triggernometry interview with Dr. Calum Miller, where he explains how he came to see abortion as not just bad for the babies, but bad for the women.
Oh, first of all, when does life begin, in your opinion?
So this is something that it's almost a frustrating question because, and meaning no discredit to you, it is seen as a matter of opinion. And as I kind of said, when I was studying medicine and I wasn't pro-life or I wasn't opposed to abortion, however you want to frame it, this was just a question in basic biology of the human being, that life begins at fertilization. That's what the embryology textbooks say. It's not really debated. There are countless textbooks and journal articles saying life begins at fertilization. And what we mean by that is this is when an individual human organism begins to exist. And it can help to clarify it in that way. I think what I'd say is that there's a study that's been done a few years ago by a researcher at the University of Chicago, and he thought, let's get this settled once and for all. And so he did a survey of the public and he said, who are the experts on this question? And about 80% of them said biologists. It's a biological question. Life is a biological concept. We are biological things. This is a biology question. So he then said, okay, let's speak to biologists. And he surveyed 5,500 biologists and said, is it true that a human organism, a new individual human organism, is created at fertilization? And he found that 95% of them said yes. And the other 5%, we don't know exactly what they think, but he got some replies saying, this is pro-life propaganda, I'm going to ruin your survey. So we can imagine that some of that dissent was propagandistic or ideological.
But I see what you're saying,
yeah.
and that makes sense. But I think the reason this conversation is being had, and I understand why you're frustrated by the question, because biologically, yes, the egg and the sperm coming together in that way begins the process. But I think most people would also accept that fertilized egg, aborting that versus dismembering a 2 or 3 month old baby or whatever, they're very different things. Right. And I think, certainly for me, I think if you're dealing with a recently fertilized egg, that's a very different conversation to a creature with a heartbeat that, and all of that. Do you know what I mean?
I certainly do. And so one of the reasons...
So, in a lot of ways, that's a matter of how you emotionally relate to the entity being destroyed. It is very hard to look at that single cell and say, yep, that's a new human being, as opposed to looking at a 20-week fetus or a preemie and going, yep, that's a new human being. So, yeah, we react emotionally very differently depending upon how similar we perceive those people as being to us. When there's a plane crash in Indonesia, for the Indonesians, that's very immediate because there's other Indonesian people, they're like us. But if you're from Korea or South Africa or the UK or Canada, you're looking at, there were 6 Canadians aboard the plane, or there were 2 South Africans aboard the plane, because they feel more like you. You feel more of an emotional connection to those people. You don't believe that their lives are more valuable than the lives of the Indonesians. It's just you feel more of an emotional connection to them. So your emotional reaction to a human death is not a measure of the value of that human life. And I think a lot of people don't get that. They don't emotionally relate to unborn babies any more than slaveholders emotionally related to the Africans they imported any more than the Nazis related to the Jews. There is this ability to distance yourself from a human if you want to devalue that human, or even, like I said, in a natural gut reaction. We tend to relate more emotionally to the deaths of people that we view as more like ourselves, and that's a natural human thing, because you're biologically programmed to want to reproduce your own genes, not somebody else's genes. So the closer they are to you, tribally, for lack of any better term, the more you react emotionally to their deaths.
As I try and clarify what the biology says, is to help clarify the debate. Because what we're not actually debating is this a human being? It clearly is a human being, even when it is a zygote. But what we want to know is...
Hold on. Well, that kind of depends on your definition of a human being, doesn't it?
Yeah, so, you know, the standard human being is a member of our species, which again is a sort of biological concept, an individual organism.
Right, I don't recognize a fertilized egg as a member of the human race. Do you?
Well, so what I would want to say is that there's a sort of moral dimension which we want to get at. And I try and say that human being is a biological concept, but we want to know, is it also a person? Is it something that has full moral status? Is it the kind of thing that we treat as a human being in the sense of one of us, a member of the moral community? So I would say it is a human being in that biological sense, and human being is a biological concept, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a person. And so what we're really debating is it a person?
Well, so, yeah, that's what I'm saying. If I saw a fertilized egg floating down the street, I wouldn't be like, oh, that's Gary. Do you know what I mean? Like, that is not instantly recognizable to me as a member of the human race.
That's another thing that's not immediately recognizable to me. Imagine extraterrestrial life, and they had been observing adult human beings. Do you think they would recognize a newborn infant as being the same species? Or do you think they'd have to study it and go, oh, this is the young phase of these adults? We are not accustomed to seeing human embryos, therefore we don't look at them and see, oh yeah, that's a human, because we don't see them on a day-to-day basis, and therefore we don't know what they look like. Just a point there.
And therefore what happens to it, my mind, and I'm working these arguments out and challenging you on it because that's what I'm trying to do, what happens to a fertilized egg or to a tiny zygote is not necessarily, to me, to be treated in the same way morally as doing that very same thing to an older baby or an adult human being or somebody outside of that situation.
Absolutely, and I completely understand that intuition, and I, for a long time, had the same intuition that, you know, this is a cell or two cells, and it's so different from our understanding of a person or a character or a personality. And what I think changed my mind on this was a couple of things. The first is that we have to have a reasoned basis for attributing moral value. And what we're essentially saying is that because this, you know, two-celled embryo doesn't have cognitive abilities, or because it's a certain size, or whatever the actual sort of intuition there is, because it doesn't have those abilities, we're excluding it from the moral community. And the problem that I began to see with this is that when you go down that line of thinking, it begins to create problems for other human beings who might have lesser cognitive abilities. What about someone who certainly is conscious, but only in a very minimal way? You know, I have patients who are clearly human beings, clearly very valued and loved by their families, who we give a name to and we treat as equal human beings. But when you actually look at their cognitive abilities, they would have fewer cognitive abilities than a mouse or a rat. And so we have a sort of incongruity here, that we don't think mice are people or, you know, equal to the rest of us. But we do treat severely disabled people as equals, and I think that's right. And the only reason we can do that is because we share something in common with them, which is our humanity. So once we go down the route of saying, if you don't have these abilities, you're no longer human and you're not a person or you're not a moral human being, then I think it actually completely undermines our entire idea of human equality. And I think that becomes really problematic.
So, by this argument, the morning after pill, is that a type of abortion then?
It's kind of controversial exactly how that operates. So,
how does it operate?
Well, it's kind of hard to say. So some what's called emergency contraception, like the copper coil, uncontroversially can act after fertilization. So there's not really any serious debate that the copper coil does act after fertilization and therefore does end the life of a very early, immature, underdeveloped human being. Other emergency contraception, whether it's desogestrel or something else, is kind of controversial, and we don't really know exactly the main way that it operates. So it's sort of difficult to say, and I know that's a little bit underwhelming.
No.
Okay, so we're going to pause at that point.